Well, good afternoon if you are in New York or the Atlantic Ocean on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Good evening if you are in Dublin or somewhere in Western Europe on that side of the Atlantic Ocean. Greetings, special love to our loved ones in Ukraine, people who are listening in India, Asia, the Pacific. Top of the morning to you. This is March 17th of 2023. And for New Yorkers and Dubliners and other people, it is St. Patrick's Day. And so I decided to have an Irish theme today. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays, by the way, on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is Fergus Sheil, who joins me from Dublin. He is the founder, I believe, and the artistic director of the Irish National Opera. Welcome, Fergus.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to be with you. Lovely to speak to you.
It's great to see you. So, where do we begin? Ireland, I've written recently, I've written a lot of books about Italy, and I recently wrote a book with Rick Steves called Italy for Food Lovers. And I said to Rick that, I love Italy, but I also love Ireland. And Rick said, well, Ireland is Italy with rain. And I think it's a very good definition. The food is delicious. The people are lovely. I'm never at a loss for a conversation wherever I travel in Ireland. People are genuinely welcoming, much more subtle than the stereotypes by a long shot. Mm-hmm. And one only need look at the national literature and the music and all of that to understand that it's not just step dancing and Guinness Stout. There's so much more to the country. And it's an ancient culture. There was a book a number of years ago, I think the author was Thomas Cahill, the last name was Cahill, called How the Irish Saved Civilization. There's been a dedication to language, to the spoken word, to song, to melody. I believe Ireland is the only country in the world that has a musical instrument on its flag, the harp. And therefore, music is very central to Ireland, all kinds of music. Did I leave anything out, Fergus?
No, but it's interesting in opera, I think, that vocally, some of our greatest singers have that type of Italianate sound. And that goes back to people like John McCormack and even James Joyce, the writer, who was a passionate singer. And a lot of the great Irish singing teachers, like the late Veronica Dunn, who died quite recently after a long career as a teacher, her training, Margaret Burke Sheridan, people like this, their foundation was in Italy. And we take our cue, I think, if you listen to some of the really great Irish singers, you wouldn't mistake them for being English singers. They were very different. The English tradition has come largely out of cathedrals and things like that, whereas in Ireland, we have that kind of umbilical link to Italy, I think.
I knew Veronica Dunn. She was quite something. She was a remarkable figure. Would you talk about Ronnie, as she was known, and her impact on Irish singing and on Irish opera?
Well, yeah, so in case your listeners and viewers don't know, Veronica Dunn was this towering figure in Ireland, a vocal teacher who taught many of the greatest singing teachers. And she really, I suppose, retired because of COVID and died not from COVID, but during the pandemic in her early 90s. And she had this remarkable, like when I was a child, she seemed like this old woman who was teaching, but she just went on and on and on and on for so long, and she had this towering really influence on singers. And I think she had a fantastic personality as well. Like she was outrageous. She would just say absolutely anything to anybody. Probably she would be cancelled now if she existed in the cancel culture, but she just had this amazing ability to get people to produce a really, really wonderful sound and to really dedicate themselves to singing. She was a person who came of age maybe in the 1940s and 50s. She got married herself and afterwards felt that marriage had hampered her career. So she always wanted her students, particularly her female students, never to get married. So she was quite strong on that. And she had a great long life and a big influence. And she was the instigator of the Veronica Dunn International Singing Competition, which has been held every 3 years in Ireland for the last 25, 30 years or so. So Ronnie, she was affectionately known. I got to know her a little bit as a student because I used to learn the piano and I would get dragged into her lessons. She would drag in any piano player she could get and say, "Will you play for this singer or that singer?" And one of the singers who I ended up playing for when we were teenagers was Miriam Murphy, who is a fantastic soprano. She also sadly died during COVID and not of COVID. And she sung Is All There With Me in 2012. So that was my introduction to Miriam Murphy through Veronica Dunn. What else can I tell you about Ronnie? Her legacy lives on. People like Tara O'Rourke, the wonderful Irish singer, mezzo, who's really at the pinnacle of her career at the moment. She was a student of Ronnie. Ronnie, often, if people came to Dublin from other parts of the country, they would go to live with her, and they would just become absolutely sort of part of the entourage that she always had around her. And lots of people came from abroad to study with her. And she had this Italianate sound, and this is why I think, in many ways, some of the great singers from Ireland have this, and Irish audiences have a terrific love of Italian opera. Undoubtedly, all the great famous Puccini, Verdi's, and Rossini, Donizetti, they're really the core of what Irish people love, both in Dublin and, of course, in Wexford. Wexford has a tremendous affinity with Donizetti, with Italian opera, and things like that. So Ronnie was one of those people who was part of the establishment in Ireland. And then just to tell you a little bit about, you mentioned earlier that I was the founder of Irish National Opera. So again, just to explain who we or what we are as a company, we were founded in 2018. There was not a national company. There was the Dublin Grand Opera Society, who put on operas in Dublin, and they evolved into a company called Opera Ireland, but they closed in 2010. So we had no company in producing the core repertoire of Irish opera in Dublin. And myself and a number of other people lobbied hard and tried to get the Arts Council and the government to address this situation. So we did that right throughout, say, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. It was a long journey. And eventually we managed to set up Irish National Opera with the support of the Arts Council in Dublin. And since 2018, we've been busy producing 6, 7, or 8 operas a year on different scales. Some of the biggest things we've done, like our recent production of the Rosenkavalier, and we also do smaller repertoire, old, new, everything in between.
So speaking of Der Rosenkavalier, which I know opened on March 5th, that's a very ambitious opera to do for all kinds of reasons. It's long, it has a big chorus, it requires fantastic singers. I know that Ireland has fantastic singers, and I want to get into the reason of why. But my notes tell me that you have Paula Murray as Octavian, Celia Byrne as the Marschallin, and Claudia Boyle as Sophie. So these are all great Irish opera singers, all of whom I've heard. Let's start with the point that Ireland has, what, 4 million people, something like that. And we were speaking earlier about Veronica Dunn, and she created this template for teaching vocal education in Ireland, even when she was not the teacher. She may have taught at Tara O'Rourke and other people, but she taught music teachers, and that idea came out of the Royal Irish Academy of Music. And I think it's a wonderful thing because it's created a way for the nation to sing. But I believe that Celia Byrne, Claudia Boyle, and Paula Murray are all very affirmed, famous singers in Ireland. And you need 3 great singers, women, for Rosenkavalier, and you got them. Did you start by acquiring the singers, or start by saying, we want to do Rosenkavalier, and who could we get?
Yeah, well, Rosenkavalier has been in my back pocket for 20 years. I've wanted to do it. So I finally I got when we have the company set up, I said, okay, it was one of my top priority operas. Just the sheer beauty of it and the emotional depth as well as the fun. You know, it's best described as a comedy, of course, but it's very emotionally deep, as you know. So I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't got these three singers at this point, you know. And it's probably 3, 4 years ago that I first talked to all three of them about doing it and doing it together. And we would have then found a set of dates that worked and that we could assemble the team and the theatre. So they were really, the three of those were our kind of raison d'etre for the project, if you like. I started with those and built the whole thing. It was also a conversation, a project like Rosenkavalier, of course, it makes sense for us to do it as a co-production, and as a co-production with Garsington and with Santa Fe. And that was also, you know, I've been talking about it for years, and our good colleagues in Garsington who I've got to know at various events and conferences, and they've done lots of Richard Strauss, but not Rosenkavalier previously. So we kind of said, I'd say it was, you know, a good 10 years ago where we started talking and said, if we ever do it, let's do it together. So they went first and it was performed there in 2021. And now we're doing it in 23. And at some point in the future, Santa Fe audiences will get to see it. So that makes it feasible for us because it also, you know, the stage setting in our production is exquisite and detailed and big, and the costumes are extraordinary, and it's of a level that we absolutely couldn't have afforded on our own, nor would it have really made sense because we can do 4 performances maximum in within our system. That's to do with the amount of time we have in the theatre and the amount of audience we can expect for an opera like Rosenkavalier. So you wouldn't really put all of that work and expense and money into something that could only get 4 performances. So at least it can be seen in other companies as well. And it's a beautiful production directed by Bruno Ravella, designed by Gary McCann. And so we started with the 3 singers and then built everything around it. And what better opera to celebrate the voice than
well, let's
that?
speak of the opening night. What was the audience response? Was Rosenkavalier well known in Ireland or not really? It's such a big opera that it's not easily produced.
No, and it hasn't been seen in Ireland for 40 years. So you could take it that, of course, the audience will have included some real opera enthusiasts who would travel the world and see it. But out of an audience of, you know, 1,500 people, you could imagine that over 90% of them have probably not seen the opera before live, 95% of them. So it's a real, I find this as a privilege in my job. We just did William Tell last year as well. That hasn't been done in Ireland for 170 years. So we have these major pieces of the repertoire that people don't know. And that's a challenge because people are more reluctant to come to an opera that they don't know. But at the same time, when they come and they do come and they experience these things, it's incredible. And the response is, why didn't I know this before? So it was an incredible reaction, instant standing ovation. You know, people clapped and clapped and clapped, and they loved it. And the comments afterwards were just really amazing. You know, everybody saying, you know, why didn't we know this opera, and how come? And isn't it wonderful that we can get to see it now?
Do you think that people responded primarily to the music, which is gorgeous, to the story, which is intricate, but also, frankly, we begin with 2 women in bed, and the curtain goes up, and Vidu vars, vidu bist, where Octavian says to the slightly older woman she is in bed with, oh, how you were, and oh, how you are. And the overture is often described as depicting an orgasm. It's a very, for a 1913 or whatever the opera was written in 1909 or 13, it's a very graphic story in the music. It's not that it physically is depicted that way, but in the music, if you are open to what the music tells you, it's really quite erotic.
It is, yeah. But I mean, it came after Electra and after Salome, and they're very hard hitting in different ways,
Yeah,
but they're extreme operas also,
yeah.
So he wasn't afraid to go there, I suppose. And I think, yeah, I think what did people react to? Um, I think the combination. I mean, isn't that the wonderful thing about opera? It's not one thing; it's all the things together. It's the design when you walk in and you see this beautiful set, and you think, "Oh my goodness!" And then this beautiful music comes at you, and these fantastic singers, and it's like more pleasures than you can imagine.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's the alchemy, isn't it, of opera? It's like how even something like the lighting can affect how you hear a singer, and it's how the two things come together, or many more than two things. It's everything that comes together.
I want to mention to our listeners, because not everyone knows, Garsington is an opera festival in southern England, and the Santa Fe Opera Festival is in New Mexico. It's one of the world's great summer opera festivals. It was founded in 1957, and almost every year since, they do a Mozart, a Richard Strauss, often a world premiere or an American premiere, and two other works.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a destination. It's a wonderful place for opera. And therefore, if Irish National Opera is co-producing with these two companies, that speaks of a level that you have reached in a very short period of time.
Also, Garsington and Santa Fe are both ideologically similar. They both do have this focus on Richard Strauss and Mozart, and for people who haven't been to either, I haven't been to Santa Fe, but I'm going this year. It's an outdoor space, or partially outdoor. And in Garsington, it's not outdoors, but it's like a pavilion theatre that is open to natural light, which is unusual in theatres. Normally, you go in and it's dark. So mostly your performance starts with light outside, and by the end it's dark, and it's a magical place. So we're kind of the odd ones out in the mix, in that we played in an actual theatre, in a normal sort of indoor theatre.
Well, actually, that's something I wanted to ask you about for Irish National Opera. From what I gather, you have different theaters in Dublin and spaces, let's say, that you perform in, and you tour around Ireland, and you've toured to Amsterdam. So when you build a production, because some of them seem to be just touring Ireland and not Dublin, others seem to be Dublin and parts of the country, and others seem to be just for Dublin. How do you decide which opera tours, how you design the scenery? What goes into creating a season that is the national opera, putting the national in the word Irish National Opera?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've got lots and lots of disadvantages as a company, and I've done my best to try and turn them into advantages. So you can say it's a disadvantage we don't own our own theatre. But the advantage to that is that we can perform anywhere we like, if we can hire the theatre or do a deal with the theatre or collaboration. So we're not tied to one venue. We're not tied to one type of opera production. So we can perform in a 200-seat or a 2,000-seat, or we can perform outdoors, or, site specific, or different things like this. So that gives us a real artistic flexibility, and in a sense, an ability to let the operas dictate what the theatres we should use. So, but in general, we would try and do 4 titles that are like full scale, full orchestra chorus, like our most recent one, Rosenkavalier. And 2 of those are in a large 2,000-seat theatre, and 2 of them are in a smaller 1,000-seat theatre. So that means you can do your Mozart, Rossini, Donizetti in the smaller, and your Wagner, Strauss, Puccini in the larger. And you have a theatre that's generally the right kind of size for the repertoire you're doing. And then also the ones that are in the smaller theatre can sometimes tour. There's a couple of other theatres in Ireland, like Cork Opera House and the Wexford Opera House, where we can tour some of the bigger productions there as well. And then separate to that, we have a whole other pattern of work which involves smaller productions, and these would go right around the country. We've been to 30 different venues within Ireland, and we would be bringing smaller productions. So this would be with an orchestra maximum of 12 players, with a cast. Well, we had 16 in one cast that we toured, but often it's smaller. It's 4, 5, 6, 7 in the cast. And we would do things there, three types of things. We'll do Baroque repertoire, and we have great partnership with the Irish Baroque Orchestra, who are fantastic. We do contemporary work, commission work that we commission ourselves at that scale. And then we also do reduced versions. Like earlier this year, we did a Don Pasquale with five principals, five principals, five chorus, and an orchestra of 12. So that's obviously reduced in scale from the original. And we bring that to audiences right around the country. And the funny thing is, the smaller productions have been some of the ones that have won awards and won, international. We have a wonderful partnership with the Royal Opera House in London. So we brought our Vivaldi. We've just brought a contemporary piece there into the Limbury Theatre, the smaller stage in the Royal Opera House. So these smaller ones are more agile. They can be quite adventurous. So we've done two Vivaldi operas, whereas before, when we did our first Vivaldi, Griselda, it was the first Vivaldi opera ever in Ireland in 2019. So, things like that. And when you bring them around to the country and you're going to regional theatres, people will come, because they don't get much opera. And when there's an opera on, people will come. So in a way, we've got great flexibility in what we can perform. Of course, they'd love to hear La Boheme, but we're not really going to do La Boheme with 12 musicians, we might do, like we did a reduced Hansel and Gretel, and we did things like that can work in a smaller. We're going to plan a new Fledermaus with a chamber ensemble rather than a full orchestra. Plus our Baroque, plus our contemporary, and people come to them. So that gives us a nice balance then between the larger and the smaller, and the old and the new.
So when you reduce Hansel and Gretel, which has 14 angels in the sky, did you have 7 angels?
No, we didn't have. We had a few children who came as part of the tour, but it was. I think we had 2.
Okay, that's
2 angels.
That's all right. So how? I mean, there are so many questions asked because it's a recently founded opera company. It's
just 5 years. Yeah, absolutely. And so, the other thing, just to say, Fred, is like, as well as not having our own theatre, like we tend not to store our productions. We don't have big storage spaces. We haven't yet really repeated any titles. We're always doing new titles. Apart from, say, some of the contemporary works that come back for international touring or something. So we keep some of the smaller productions, but the larger ones are often like a co-production where we'll go. Our William Tell went over to Switzerland to a new company in Fribourg, so that's there for the moment. The Rosenkavalier will move around. We co-produced Carmen with Philadelphia, so they store that. So we don't have massive storage. We've a small bit of storage space, and so we don't have like big technical workshops. There's a very good company here who build sets. We don't own them. They're an independent company. They'll build us our sets. And if we don't have a co-producing partner, we do the opera, and sadly the sets then get recycled. But we're getting more and more partners involved, and also because of the economics and the kind of the sustainability agenda. Like we did a really beautiful La Cenerentola in 2019, and it was just so exquisite, and it broke my heart that it went, after 4 performances, it was all dismantled and recycled and put away.
So when you did La Cenerentola, Cinderella, it was with Tara Arad, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And she then came to New York, where she was going to do Cenerentola at the Metropolitan Opera.
Correct. Yes.
She rehearsed. I saw her here, not in performance, and then everything shut down because of the pandemic, and she never got to sing it here. So my question for you is about the pandemic in Ireland, that your company shut down like almost all did, but then you created what's called a site-specific production of Electra at Kilkenny Castle. I love Kilkenny Castle. I love all of Ireland, so I love it there too. It's a magnificent outdoor space. And would you talk about this production, which I didn't see? I mean, obviously, Electra is incredibly ambitious, in that it has a huge orchestra, but I believe you pre-recorded your orchestra.
Mhm.
Did you have live singers? How did you space out the audience? How did you stage this?
Yeah, it's actually we have a video of it which we have never put online, so we must do that soon, and then you can see it. Um, so that came about because during the pandemic, the Arts Council of Ireland were very supportive to companies, and they wanted us to support artists. So they really wanted us not to stop and do nothing, to do what we could in order to provide employment for people, and of course we wanted the same thing as well. So we were given some, I think we got increased funding for 2021, and we had this money and we needed to find a project of scale to spend it on. And of course, we thought of lots of ways. Outdoors was the only option. And when you plan operas, as you well know, it takes a long time to plan something. So in the pandemic, everything got much shorter. You'd have an idea, and suddenly 3 months later, you'd be doing it because you didn't know. You had to make guesses about what conditions would apply 3 months later. So we decided, our friends at the Kilkenny Arts Festival got in touch and said, can we do anything together outdoors? So I went to Kilkenny. I had to get a special letter of dispensation to be allowed to drive outside the zone where I lived. Drove down to Kilkenny, had a look in the Castle Yard. I mean, I know the Castle Yard well, but the one thing that two ideas came to my head. You could do a very, very beautiful Lucia di Lammermoor there, set outdoors. Then this Electra came to my mind. And it occurred to me that one way or the other, however you did the orchestra, they were not going to be there. They could have been somewhere else connected digitally. People were doing that type of thing at the time. There was really, I don't know if there was even anywhere in Kilkenny big enough to hold a 2 meter distance 79-piece orchestra, which is what we ended up with. So, I just decided in the end that it's obviously it's a compromise. It's not how you want to do any piece with an orchestra in a different venue. But it occurred to me that you could probably do it better by pre-recording, because there'd be some stability. If you pre-recorded it, people would know how the tempos were going to go, and there'd be a better chance. And in something like Lucia, you could never do that, or a Mozart or anything, because you don't know how a singer is going to inflect any phrase or anything like that. Whereas with Electra, really, the orchestra drives it like an express train, and it starts and it goes, and you get on that train and you stay on the train. So I just had this mad idea that let's just do Electra. So we hired the large theatre in Dublin where I recorded the orchestra, the 2,000-seat theatre, and we put them on stage, not in the pit. And the stage there is really big. If you take away all the sides and everything, open it right back to the scenic dock, we had this enormous space of 2 meters apart orchestra. So what I did was we had one period of rehearsal with the singers, where we rehearsed the opera. And then when I kind of had established with them how we were going to do it, I then went off and recorded the orchestra. And then there was a gap where we had to, edit and mix the recording. And then we came back for the final sets of rehearsals now with the track. So we had a few more weeks of working with the actual track. And then we moved down to the Castle Yard. So we set up a whole outdoor surround sound type setup. And we had huge monitors of me conducting, which was filmed while I conducted the actual orchestra. At the beginning, the cast said, "Yeah, but you have to conduct live as well. You have to conduct us." And I said, "Okay, well, we'll see how we go." But in the end, they didn't need me live because they got used over weeks. You get used to watching for the key moments. So they sung live, amplified, and mixed in with the orchestra, and we performed outdoors. We had 5 performances planned, but we had to cancel one because of rain, which never arrived, which infuriated me. There was like an orange weather. We have this system of weather warnings, and it was like orange is the next down from red. And so we basically had no choice but to cancel. And it was a beautiful balmy evening, and all of us sat outside a pub in Kilkenny drinking drinks when we should have been in there performing. Infuriating. And then the next day, when there was no weather forecast, there was no rain forecast. Of course, it did rain, but
Sure.
the singers were determined to go on, and they performed in the rain, and it was really like the castle is so beautiful, so that it almost was like the set for us. And what we did was we built a staircase in various ways to sort of access different levels and to bring people into the courtyard, maybe in different ways from the actual building. But the building was essentially the set. And we also projected video images that we took from the orchestral recording. So we gave like this image of a vast orchestra playing, not all the way throughout, but at certain moments. It was beautiful, but we could only have like 100 people per show. It was
in the audience.
Yeah,
really.
They had to be 2 meter distance from each other as well, and
because that is a spacious area there. I've been in that courtyard.
Yes, but I think there was one of the rules at the time was that you couldn't have more than 100 people gathering outdoors. So that was it. But we will put the video online because it was. And we made afterwards. Then we brought the singers back into a recording studio to actually record it. So we have. I think it's phenomenal how we did this with the orchestra 2 meters apart, and the singers recorded like 6 weeks after the orchestra laid it down. So it's quite something.
Was it staged, semi-staged, or in concert?
Staged. Fully staged.
Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
So when Electra, her first line is "a line alone."
Yeah.
Was she kind of alone on the stage?
yeah, absolutely. She was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was done in German, I assume.
It was done in German, yes.
Okay.
And most of the singers, a lot of, like, say, the five maid, the Electra was Giselle Allen, who's a fantastic singer from Belfast. The Chrysotomies is Maura Flavin. Clayton-Nestor is a melody drum. So they were great Irish singers who were available to us. We had to bring in some guests from Germany to sing Orest and Egist. And they had to agree to come 2 weeks early and isolate in a hotel for 2 weeks. And all that sort of stuff, It was,
Well, another direction I want to go in this topic, Ireland famously is one of the world's great countries for theater, for spoken theater, and production, stage direction. There's the Gate, there's the Abbey in Dublin, there are theaters throughout the country. And to what degree has your company sought to inform its productions with Irish theater practices from the spoken theater?
Yeah, well, certainly we've used a lot of theater directors, also dance directors, film directors. We've engaged a lot of people who are writers. I kind of look at it as I want to try and find all the talents that are in Ireland and bring them into opera. And some of these people are people who would have never considered, just never really thought about opera, because in a sense, for generations, opera has not been at the heart of the cultural life of Ireland. And even when there were opera performances, like when I was a child growing up, there was an opera company, Dublin Grand Opera Society, but it was like a club. Like, it existed for the people who went and nobody else went. And if you were in that club, you got to see your operas. But if you weren't in the club, there was never anybody in the door saying, "Come in, this is brilliant, this is amazing, this is an incredible experience that'll change your life." And so that's one of the things that we really try to do. And we do this through sort of lots of outreach projects. We do it by touring around the country. We do it to our digital projects. And absolutely then we want to bring the talents of Ireland in. So we have like amazing theatre makers like Enda Walsh, who directed operas that he'd written himself with Donncha Dennehy, but also Bluebeard's Castle he directed for us. A fantastic filmmaker, Hugh O'Connor, who's worked with us, choreographer Emma Martin, who's absolutely stunning. So all these people whose background is not necessarily opera, but they've tried it out and they've liked it and they've done some incredibly interesting work. So that's that for me is really interesting. And you see that a lot of there's a huge interaction now between us and the theatre sector in a way that never existed before. And I think for the younger generation in particular, because we have a studio program as well for young artists, and we have directors on that as well as conductors and as well as singers, obviously. But so we're trying to trying to get a whole young generation of people into opera and trying to let them feel that it's natural. Because sometimes, like occasionally, there have been people who come from a theatre background and they just can't quite get their head around what this opera actually is and what makes it tick in a sense. And I think if you get people in early and they kind of grow up with opera, there's a much better chance that they'll sort of feel native in it.
Mhm.
And that's also one of the things that I think is different about what we're doing from in the past, that we're trying to invest in the broader ecosystem. So we want to train up Irish repetiteurs and, people with specialist skills around singing, languages, basically all those areas of opera expertise that, in a sense, they never got developed. I remember when I only came into opera. I did a degree in music, but I had no knowledge or interest in opera whatsoever while I was doing my degree. And it was only after I graduated, I was trying to make my mark as a conductor, and somebody said, "Well, you better conduct some opera." And I said, "Okay." So I wrote to the Wexford Festival and I said, "Can I come and be an assistant?" And they said, "Well, we don't have assistant conductors." And so I went. I said I badgered them into taking me for nothing, which they did. But there weren't there weren't avenues automatic avenues in a way. Like you had to fight in the door. And then once I got in the door, I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. I had no idea this existed. And it's been a bit of a mission of mine then ever since to try and get rid of those doors, try and be as open as possible so that like we encourage school children to come and do work experience for a week with us, just to sit in and watch. And we have lots of links to all the universities, not just the third level, the ones that train singers, but the ones that are training stage managers and directors and designers, academic composers. We get involved with all the different types of universities and third level colleges, not just conservatories. And we encourage them, and I go and talk a lot in universities, and we have a whole outreach team who does that as well. And just to really blast that door open and say, come inside and experience this. It could change your life.
I want listeners who may not know of the Wexford Festival to learn about that in the context of Ireland, because it's important to say that, yes, there has been opera in Ireland for a very long time. The Wexford Festival, in my memory, was founded in 1950 in the town of Wexford, which is south of Dublin, in a beautiful part of Ireland, but all of Ireland is beautiful. And it's a very charming town by the sea. I worked there, if I remember, in 2016, and the festival is in October and the weather is kind of raw, and you walk through the town and you're blown with breezes from the sea, and the grass is green and horses are trotting around, but the town itself is a regular town. And in recent years, they built an opera house. It's a very beautiful opera house. And before that, the festival seemed to have been founded on the principle of doing lost works, not necessarily Irish operas, but largely Italian operas, as you were saying earlier, that there's a very strong connection and affinity in Ireland for Italy and its art, its operas, and so forth. I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that they're both Catholic countries.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting idea. Now, having said that, church music in Ireland is really terrible. Apart from the Protestant cathedrals, which would have come from the English tradition, have some very good church music. And there are one or two Catholic churches that run very good music programs. But in general, if you choose any Catholic church in Ireland and go in on a Sunday, you're not going to hear something that's going to lift your soul to heaven, I'm afraid.
And I should say parenthetically, the Republic of Ireland is a Catholic country, and Northern Ireland is both Catholic and Protestant.
Yeah. But the Wexford Festival, it's a real gem. I mean, it's always been this really high quality. You could hear fantastic singers. Juan Diego Flores was there when I was working there. Of course, I didn't appreciate that at the time, but you have astonishingly brilliant singers doing really interesting repertoire, but also repertoire that is completely unknown. So I grew up like learning the Leoncavallo La Boheme before I ever heard the Puccini one, and the Paisiello Opera of Seville before I heard the Rossini one.
Yeah.
And it was funny. I remember when we were doing La Boheme, and they said, I can't get used to the fact that Marcello is a tenor and Rodolfo is a baritone. And I'm looking at them saying, what's wrong? What's the problem?
So my
That's
next
what they
question
call
is sort of a two-part question. The first part is very short. Have you been to New York?
it. Well, personally, I have, but not as a company.
Oh, I mean you,
Yeah, of course, yeah,
Fergus.
many
Okay.
times. Yeah.
And what did you do here musically in terms of your travels and theatrically in terms of what you experienced in the city?
Well, Um, I should say just by the way that we as a company were due to be in New York, except for that bloody pandemic. We had already planned and announced one of our operas, The Second Violinist by Donncha Dennehy, was scheduled for the Armory in Park Avenue in 2020, and sadly that fell by the wayside. With one of my earlier companies, which was called Wide Open Opera, which was like an antecedent, we brought a different opera by Donncha Dennehy and Andrew Walsh to St. Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn. And we had a lovely time with that in 2015, and that was part of the Prototype Festival. And I have very good links with Beth Morrison, so I'm across a lot of her work. I'm very excited about what she's doing. We're co-producing a piece by an Irish composer, Emma O'Halloran, which was in her festival this year. So I keep in touch with Beth and what she's doing. And then, of course, I go to the Met whenever I can, and I've had some fantastic experiences there. I'm just trying to think. Well, seeing Tara Rock in Tales of Hoffman, I was there for her Met debut, which was fantastic.
As Niklaus.
Yes, Niklaus. Yeah. She was wonderful. But I've seen many operas in the Met, and I was there this year for the Lindemann, the Young Artist competition that has its finals in, it was early.
I was there too, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, and I'm afraid that I don't go to Broadway. I just look at what's on in the Met, or if
I'll tell you why I asked, but I want to say parenthetically first that for listeners who don't know the name Beth Morrison, Beth was on this program about 2 years ago, actually. She is a remarkable figure in opera in America in that she's an independent producer who manages to persuade enough people to create new art and enough other people to part with their money to make that art happen, that she's created a body of work as a producer that in modern times is second to none in the United States. So people want to find that can go to Idagio and enter Fred Plotkin, Beth Morrison, or YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin, Beth Morrison, and find that conversation. The reason I asked you very specifically is that we in New York City have a gem of a theater on 22nd Street called the Irish Repertory Theater. It's a magnificent company.
Yes.
It is as good as what you have in Ireland in terms of Irish repertory.
Yeah.
And I have gone for many, 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 many years, and many Irish artists come over, but also Americans of Irish descent and sometimes not of Irish descent perform there. And it's just one of the best repertory theaters anywhere. And most of the plays and musicals they do have some Irish connection, but not all. And right now is a production of Samuel Beckett's Endgame. That is just a fantastic production that they've extended. I don't know for how much longer, with a great cast. And here is the second part of my question. In my early career, I worked a lot at La Scala, and I maintained connection involvement there. La Scala, in 2019, I believe, did the world premiere. I'm checking my notes. 2018. I'm sorry, November 2018, of the opera version of Samuel Beckett's Endgame. Fin de partie in French, by György Kurtag. And I was thinking when I attended the play recently, and knowing that I was going to talk to you, that this seems like a natural for your company.
Yeah, I saw the opera when it was performed in Amsterdam. It was a co-production between La Scala and Amsterdam. Pierre Audi directed it, didn't he? Yeah, it would be a great thing to do. It's a massive, massive orchestra. So for
Yeah.
me, something like that would have to go into our biggest theater, and it's. I would be nervous about attracting an audience to a 2,000-seat theater for enough performances of it. So it's certainly something we could think about. But it's
Even though it's Samuel Beckett, who is a
yeah.
Nobel Prize winning author from Ireland.
Yeah, there's the Morton Feldman Neither as well,
Hmm.
which we could do, and there's also Krap's Last Tape by a Romanian composer who his name has slipped my mind.
Yeah.
But so there's a number of options. I was interested to know when I saw Le Fin de Partie, I wondered how the experience would compare to seeing the play. And I haven't seen the play since. What did you think? You've seen the opera and the play.
I've seen the opera on video. I
Okay.
did not, I mean, I was actually working in Milan when that was on, but I was working on a different production.
Yes.
And it opened after I saw the sets, I saw everything in the theater,
Yeah.
but I did not see the performance.
Yes.
I think it would work. I just think that, it's sort of a natural fusion. It's kind of like doing things that are James Joyce themed,
Yes.
just because he was such a passionate opera lover.
Yes.
That there are ways into James Joyce, there are ways into Samuel Beckett.
Yeah.
Because ultimately I wanted to add something that you may have mentioned and I didn't quite pick up on, is the fact that you as a company have created and endorsed many new Irish operas, many, not one or two, but 20 or 30 or something like that.
That's right.
And therefore, I would guess that your audiences are open to the new if there's an Irish connection.
So yes, absolutely. And when I say we have done 20 or 30, but some of them are very short. Just to be honest, we did a fantastic project during the pandemic called 20 Shots of Opera. And there were 20 newly commissioned operas, but they're all 5 to 10 minutes in duration. So they're short, made specifically for film. And they're like at the worst part of the lockdown, because the government rules at the time permitted broadcasting and filmmaking as an activity, even under the most extreme level of lockdown. So we were able to continue with that. And it was a fantastic project. It brought us a lot of international. We got great reviews in Wall Street Journal and lots of German newspapers and French, Italian. They all paid attention to it. So it was really good for us. But apart from that, we've done a lot of other operas. And if we're to pilfer the Irish plays, I think the most successful of the operas I've seen is Gerald Barry's Importance of Being Earnest, which takes the Oscar Wilde play and turns it into a hilarious, fantastic opera. So and something like that, we put it on again. It was with an earlier company that I put it on, and a lot of people came to it. But I think that some people thought they were coming to see the play and got a shock when they heard Gerald Barry's score. But yeah.
I for listeners who may not know this the way you and I would say it in shorthand, it's obvious that in almost every case when a play is adapted into an opera, they're not doing the text of the play. So the Tosca is not the play by Victoria and Sardou. The exception would probably be Metterling's play Pelléas and Melisande that Debussy basically set in its words. But that's really the exception. There may be a couple of others. And therefore, when you're creating an opera from a play or a novel, is played out differently. So, for example, if I were to do an opera of Sean O'Casey's Juno and the Paycock, Juno has a long speech about I carried you into the world and I carry you on your day of your death, and it's a magnificent speech. That would be an aria unto itself. It would be a very long, detailed aria, but all the dialogue between Captain Boyle and Jacques Daly would get lost. It would be sort of recitative, it would be a lot of patter and jokes, but it would not really work. And you'd have to have, I would think, orchestral comment that would suggest their relationship rather than 20 minutes of banter between two fellows speaking a lot of blarney.
I think,
Um,
I mean, I have to say that that's exactly one of the challenges. And when you start with a play and turn it into an opera, I, 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 I sort of, I wonder about that as an approach. Like, I think Gerald did it magnificently, but a lot of the times I think, well, why are we doing this as an opera when it's a perfectly good play?
mhm,
So I think you have to have something different to say. For my money, the type of contemporary operas I don't like are the ones where you say a line, I say a line, you say a line, I say a line. I
right.
think, well, why turn this into an opera? Let's just say our lines. So if you're going to do something absolutely radical and new and innovative, well, you have the wonderful thing in opera that two people can sing at the same time, and it's amazing how composers forget this. They write
Mhm,
these operas that are plays turned into operas, and three people or four people or a whole chorus can, and you can treat time differently. I think in an opera that what you do in a play, like so. In a play, something might be more linear, but with an opera, you can mess around in all sorts of ways, and that's what I love. Like we just did this opera. It was written by Brian Irvine, who's from Northern Ireland, and directed by Nisha Jones, who's a fantastic video-based director, designer, British. And it's the story of Rosemary Kennedy, sister of JFK, and she had a tragic life. She was a fourth phlebotomy when she was 23, which incapacitated her. And what we wanted to do was kind of explore her life and take her out of the shadows and show her. And we did it not through saying like, here, Rosemary was born and then this happened and then she died. It was, but like this kind of exploration of aspects of her life told through all sorts of medical records and diaries and letters. But it's all kind of like in this incredibly creative way that it was done, spectacularly produced, and I think that's really fresh because this could not have been a play. This couldn't have been a book. It couldn't have been a film. It had to be an opera. There
mhm.
was no other way of expressing the story the way we were expressing it, other than through this thing which is music and singing and video and all these elements coming together. So that excites me a lot about new opera that can be really tell us something about ourselves and our lives and our worlds and everything that's about it, but do it in this kaleidoscopic way that it's almost like overpowering in terms of it hits you emotionally in so many different ways, which like all the great operas do.
Mhm. In fact, that was my next question, was about this opera about Rosemary Kennedy. What was the title?
Least like the other, and that came
Okay.
from one of the intelligence tests that she was asked. Like she would be shown four pictures of three forks and a knife, and she'd have to pick out which one was least like the other.
Uh-huh.
And that was like a whole system at the time of categorizing people according to their intelligence, and she was labeled as a moron, but there was imbecile, idiot, all these sort of terms which we wouldn't use anymore.
Yeah.
But and it just makes you think about the way we treat people that are perceived to be other or different, or and not that she didn't begin life as terribly different. She like it was maybe she had a mild learning difficulty, is what we would say nowadays. But I think when she got to her early 20s and she had a rebellious streak and was possibly going to be, sleeping around, or men would take advantage of her or whatever, that the father felt he had to put a stop to this in case there
Yeah.
was any scandal. And very tragic story. And then she lived this long life. She'd only died in 2005,
Yeah.
so a long life of incapacity.
Yeah. As we're sitting here, I'm thinking that in recent years, which is to say the past 60 or 70, Americans have had a lot of presidents with links to Ireland.
That's right.
The Kennedy family, obviously, Ronald Reagan was of Irish background. Um,
Barack Obama.
I was about to say Barry Obama, but
But I actually did have an Irish cousin, like
I know that he actually does
I mean,
have
we
Irish.
we we joked about his name. Oh, apostrophe Bama.
And of course, our current, to me, beloved president, Joseph Biden,
Yes.
who who because he has perhaps had a stutter, got over his stutter by memorizing Irish poetry, especially Seamus Heaney,
Yes, yeah,
to
he's a
be
big
able
Heaney
to
fan.
recite
Yeah,
the poetry as a
yeah,
means of
yeah.
controlling his speech. And he has a very strong affinity with Ireland.
Hmm.
Um, he also, if I were ever to meet him, I have the very strong sense that he's much more oriented toward culture and the arts than he lets on.
Hmm.
Because in our country, apart from the Kennedy family, and to some degree Eisenhower, and actually to some degree Richard Nixon, um, most presidents they don't want to show their affinity for the arts.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I just get a sense that Biden knows a lot more than he'll let on.
Yeah.
The Bush family senior, Barbara and George Bush, knew a lot about arts and culture, but they
Hmm.
just never advertised that
Yeah.
particularly.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that because it impressed me that when you were talking about the pandemic, the Irish government seemed to have lined up behind the arts in a very strong way.
Yes, I would say now things are good, but it's
Hmm.
coming from a low base.
Yeah,
I often think I compare ourselves to countries, say like Finland, which is a similar population and became
yeah,
independent from Russia around the same time that we became independent from Ireland in the early 1920s, from
from
the
England.
from England in the
Yeah.
early 1920s. And you see what they did about arts and culture, and we have this excuse that, oh, well, we were very poor throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Um, but like historically, public policy towards the arts was very poor in Ireland. And it is rising now, and it's rising from a low base. Every other country in Europe has a national opera company for hundreds of years, or well, certainly decades, if not hundreds of
Hmm.
years. And they would have a national theatre like bang in the center, or you will go into the center of any major European city. There's the theatre. It's like a monument to arts and culture.
Hmm.
And we don't have that, so it's a fight to get there. Now currently the government are supportive, and the Arts Council are very supportive and take great pride in the work that we've done and others. So we feel that there's wind in the sails, and we're going in the right direction. And we're very grateful for the support, but it's not before it's time either. That's
Hmm.
what I would say. So. Um,
I
and
see your point about Ireland and Finland. Finland has 5.2 million people.
Yes.
I've worked there a great deal. Um,
Yeah.
I would point to a couple of differences. One is that Ireland is an island off
Yes.
the west coast of Great Britain, whereas Finland is a very large country
Mm.
geographically that sits between a border with Russia and then the Soviet Union on one side, Sweden on the other, weather that's a lot worse than Ireland,
Hmm.
and a language that's impenetrable. All of you speak Gaelic, and you can speak amongst yourselves in Gaelic, but almost every Irish person I've ever known also speaks fluent English. The
Hmm.
Finns use their language as a defense mechanism because the Russians and the Swedes could not learn Finnish. So amongst themselves, they promoted Finnish until the Russians, and before that, the Swedes, banned the use of Finnish language. So
Yeah.
in Helsinki, there was the Alexander Theater, which was Russian. There was the Swedish theater, and the Finns did not have their theater.
Hmm.
And when finally Russia, Soviet Union was put out around 1905, I believe, was the
Hmm.
independence, but then there were issues beyond that. The Alexander Theater became the opera house for the Finnish National Opera, except it was not national.
Hmm.
But not until 1993 did they have an opera house in
Hmm.
Helsinki, a beautiful one.
Hmm.
But it's about assertion of their identity when surrounded by hostility. And I'm not in any way underestimating the British impact on Ireland, but the geography was a bit different.
Yes, but also I think when we became independent, things like classical music or opera, that was foreign. That's kind of that's for the English. That's not for the Irish. So, and in fact, what developments there were, say, for example, in the RT's our national radio station, and they originally had two orchestras, and we needed to populate that orchestra, and they turned to continental Europe. So a lot of German, French, people came and settled in Ireland. Even things like the army bands, they all got German conductors in because you couldn't have an English conductor to come to the army band. So there was and a lot of the schools of music that existed, they weren't big or anything, but there was a municipal school of music in Dublin and in Cork, and they brought like there was a fantastic quartet from Romania who came in the 1950s to Cork, and the legacy of that is still there in terms of the string playing that comes from the Cork School of Music. So it's interesting that like where we have acted, it's been this kind of hardwire to the continent rather than to Britain. And then we thought we got over that, but now because of Brexit again, we feel much more connected to, we're very committed members of the European Union, and we're very committed to our European colleagues, and the fact that Britain has left is just feels like a loss for them, and so there's lots more ferry lines and direct sort of flights to the continent. You don't go to, so it's interesting, but so I think there is and also if you look historically, things like, I'm always amazed, Madame Butterfly was performed in Dublin 3 years after it was world premiere. I was a touring company, but you think, that wouldn't happen now. Some major opera performed in Europe wouldn't necessarily hit Dublin within 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's not quite true to say, like, it's not that we had no tradition, we had a tradition here, and a lot of Baroque composers from the continent, from Italy, came and lived and worked. Geminiani and various other people came to Dublin to work. Handel, of course, came as well. And
that was my next question, was about him. Yeah.
So
Georg Friedrich Handel, born in Halle in Germany, trained in Venice, was a great Italian opera composer who also wrote oratorio in English. He lived much of his life in London on Brook Street, 34 Brook Street, if I recall. But his most famous work was composed in and for Dublin. And that namely is Messiah, not the Messiah, but Messiah.
Yeah.
That was created, if I remember correctly, as an Easter time work, although it's come to be known as a Christmas time work.
Yeah.
Talk about Handel and Dublin, obviously that, but also about your company and its relationship to Handel.
Well, first of all, Handel is, I only discovered much later on in life that while he was in Dublin, he stayed in Clontarf Castle, which is like just right around the corner from where I grew up. And the thought that Handel was around the corner composing is incredible.
Yeah.
So we have not, as Irish National Opera, we have not done any Handel yet, and partly the reason, well, there's no boycott on them or anything. It's just that I've got into this Vivaldi groove for the moment.
Yeah,
we're exploring some Vivaldi operas, largely because there has been a lot of Handel in Ireland. One of our previous companies, Opera Theatre Company, when it was led by James Conway, did a lot of Handel operas, and it was very ahead of its time in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, discovering these Handel works that at the time didn't have the currency that they have now. And I just felt when we started that we would just take a look at some of the other Baroque works for a while. We will absolutely come to Handel. But I fell in love with Vivaldi through the Cecilia Bartoli CD of Vivaldi's arias, and they're just so astonishingly brilliant. So I started listening to a lot of Vivaldi, and we have done 2, and we have a third one in the plans for 2024. So we'll go through this little phase for a while, and then we'll look at some other Baroque repertoire. So we haven't done Handel, but he is a well-known sort of figure in the operatic scene in Ireland.
Here's what I'm thinking about that there's not only the operas, which are magnificent to me, but his oratorios can be very theatrical. Samson in particular, but there are quite a few that have validity on the stage and would permit the kind of staging that you were talking about. Sometimes there are logistical limitations, and you usually have a small orchestra. And it
Absolutely,
would
yeah.
make a certain kind of touring opera if you pick, or performance, if you pick the right one.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
maybe looking at some of the oratorios as
Yeah,
theater works
yeah,
and getting one of those great Irish directors to get
yes.
involved in it. Um,
Have you seen any, I know it's been done a few times in different places, a staging of Messiah?
yes, I've not worked on one, but I've seen them. There was one
Yeah,
here at the Armory that was quite wonderful.
yeah,
And it works. It certainly
yeah.
works.
I
Absolutely.
think that's something if we could, and I have somebody in mind who I've been sort of toying with this idea with them. So we'll see if anything comes of that. But I think that's something, if we could get that right, could be a really interesting thing for us to do.
And a few months ago, I believe November, if I recall, I did a lecture for the Wagner Society of Ireland
Oh, great.
online, virtually, the way we're
Yeah.
doing this now. And Wagnerites are a very passionate bunch. Obviously, there's a very famous Irish connection in that Isolde is Irish.
Hmm.
But is there anything Wagnerian that you would consider, or are the logistics? I mean, if you do Rosenkavalier and William Tell, you can do
Yeah.
logistics.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Fred, when the first opera I produced was Tristan and Isolde. Um, and it was, I mentioned earlier, but your sound might have cut out for a moment, that Miriam Murphy sang the role of Isolde,
Mhm.
was sadly not with us anymore.
Yeah, I know.
Uh, was a wonderful Isolde. And in history, although the role of Isolde is an Irish queen, or princess, she is the only person in history, only Irish person ever to sing the role of Isolde. And that was in 2012 that we did that. And it was, you would think, people thought I was mad doing Tristan, but I wanted to do it because of this Irish connection and because of Miriam. And we got this grant from the Arts Council, not unexpectedly, but I, it was our first grant application, and I was a bit audacious. I said, okay, let's do this. Let's do it full scale, big orchestra, big theater, 2,000 seat theater, big cast, costed it up. I think I needed 600,000 euro at the time.
Mhm.
Said, okay, you want opera? Here's opera, 600,000. And within a few weeks, I got this letter saying we've awarded you 600,000 euro. And I was like, gobsmacked. I literally had to read the letter about 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it.
Mhm.
And we put it on. And it was it was a very short lead in with 6 months from the letter to the production. And we hired in a production which was from Welsh National Opera. So we didn't have to create it from scratch. But we put together the cast, and it was just one of the most joyous things ever to do. And I haven't done any Wagner since then, not out of a lack of love for Wagner, but parts, as you do more and as you get more experience, I realized the pitfalls that I could have fallen into that I was lucky to avoid by sheer
Mhm.
luck. And we absolutely definitely will do Wagner. And like, here's another thing, like the ring cycle has not been done since 1913 in Ireland.
Mhm.
So nor have Meister Sing has probably never been done in the country.
Yeah.
Parsifal possibly never. So, you know, so there's big gaps. And it's a question of, does part of me feel, okay, the thing to do would be to just go big and do the ring cycle, maybe one a year. And I'm really attracted to that idea. And lots of people who are older and wiser than me are warning me off it. And
I'm older than you, I think. I'm not wiser, but
I'm sure you are.
my inclination would be to start you with Parsifal when I'm thinking for Ireland,
Yeah.
because it requires first-class musicianship, orchestra playing, chorus, and it's a long opera. For people who are observing Catholics in Ireland, it would have a resonance that may go very deep, and I think may start discussion in the media and the public forums about the ideas of he didn't call it an opera, a stage consecrating play, I think he called it. But it's not that many cast members.
That's true.
For
Yeah.
one thing, whereas the Ring Cycle, you have big chorus. We also have all the Norns and the
Yeah.
Rhine Maid and Wotan's in-laws and all of
Yes.
those
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I think that Parsifal logistically and also in terms of a set is a lot more manageable than the Ring that requires all kinds of special effects.
Yeah.
And I think that the Irish would have the patience to sit for that, I think.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that you can build a public conversation around
Yes. Yeah.
that would attract attention.
Yeah.
And I would do it just in Dublin, and I think that people would come to Dublin for it.
Mhm.
Maybe you want to do it in the Good Friday period, which is when historically the Met has done it.
Yeah.
So that there are reasons to do it at that time in that place.
Yeah.
And I think you have the singers. It's
Oh, yeah.
another reason. Yeah.
I'm sure we could cast it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that
So
that
yeah,
would
so there will be Wagner coming, but not
Good.
not in the next 1 or 2 years, but I hope before too long.
Mhm. So regular listeners know that I always ask my guests to provide selections from the Adagio catalog, and we've sort of touched on some of them, except for one that I'll ask you about. But we've touched on Tristan and Isolde. You have the Carlos Kleiber, Margaret Price, Renee Colo. You have Rosenkavalier conducted by Karajan, the final trio, Anna Tomova Sintov, Agnes Baltza, Janet Perry. I might have picked a different one. Why did you pick that one?
Well, mainly for the sumptuousness of what Karajan does. I just find it so beautiful. I'm terrible because
he did two. He did in 1956. This is 1984.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been listening to it a lot, and I just love it. I mean, I'm not always the world's #1 fan of Karajan, but in this case, I think the sound is so glorious.
And then you picked what is often my favorite opera, William Tell.
Oh, great.
With Gabriel Baquet, Montserrat Caballé, Nicolai Gedda in the impossible role of Arnold.
Yeah.
He sang it beautifully, Lamberto Gardelli.
Yeah.
Magnificent opera. That's all.
It's just so. I mean, it's so wonderful. It's so life affirming. It's an opera in a sense. Like there's not much plot in it really, but it's about community. It's about a shared experience of life, nature, weather, spirits. The everything about what's good about community, about people, family, love, all of those things, and it ends in this like heavenly C major section, and in a way it's a difficult like experience. You know these long operas, and we performed it. We had some cuts, but it was still over 4 hours in duration. It's like a pilgrimage or something. It's like you go into this tunnel and you give yourself over to it. And if I were to play you the last 3 minutes of William Tell, yeah, it's lovely. But when you've had the previous 4 hours, it's just the most spiritual and uplifting thing imaginable. So it's like it's a difficult. I remember people playing when I didn't know Tristan, somebody playing me the Liebestod, and it's beautiful. But on its own, when you don't know the rest of the opera and when you haven't heard it, it has nothing of the power of the journey that gets you there and delivers you that Liebestod at the end. So it's worth it, I think, William Tell.
And then you picked a recording that I love. I actually attended the performances that led to this recording. It's not the recording that people think of for Aida by Verdi. It was the one conducted by Antonio Pappano in Rome, not in London, with Anya Harteros, who I think the world of, Jonas Kaufmann, who I like and very much, Ludovic Tessier, who I like very much. Their Aida. So it's not necessarily the most Italianate Aida of all. It's not the most Egyptian Aida, whatever that would be.
Yeah.
And it was done in concert version and then recorded. But it's an absolutely thrilling performance. Why did you pick that one?
Well, I have to say, like, of all the conductors who are working now, as opposed to the Carryans or the Gardellis or people like that, I just adore Papano's work. I just think he has such heart and warmth about him. And I adore the opera, and yes, the cast that you've mentioned are fantastic. I heard Ludwig Tessier recently in London for the first time live, and oh my God, it was like
Mhm.
Birdie singing. It was what was it that he was doing? Forza del Destino, and
Yeah.
it was just so beautiful. So all the others as well. I mean, Anya Harteros I heard in Munich, not in Aida. It was in Tannhäuser, but she's a phenomenal singer as well. So when
Yeah.
I put that one on, it just speaks to me emotionally as a piece. Well, I mean that performance of it.
To me, Anya Hardrose is a phenomenon unto herself.
Hmm.
Um, we only had her in two things here at the Met, in Traviata and Le Nozze di Figaro,
Hmm.
and splendid in both. And I got to know her a bit here, but she has chosen to center her career basically in
Yeah,
Central Europe, which is to say Vienna, Salzburg, especially Munich, Zurich, with
yeah,
occasional forays to Milan, Rome, and London and
yeah,
Paris.
yeah.
And so therefore, before the pandemic, I tended to schedule my travels and my work in Europe to coincide with wherever she was singing and
Yeah.
whatever she was singing, frequently with Jonas Kaufmann, and they make a wonderful artistic team. They get each other, they have a similar
Mhm.
sensibility. And although both are Germans, they're among the best in foreign languages currently on our stage.
Mhm.
So that her or his Italian and French
Mhm.
are remarkable.
Yeah.
And they create a lot of energy together. And I saw them in Don Carlo and then Andrea Chenier and all kinds
Mhm.
of things.
Mhm.
And so I was thrilled that you picked that one because it's not the Aida that most people
Yes.
identify.
Yeah.
And finally, Gerald Barry, Alice's Adventures Underground, an opera from 2016 with the Irish soprano Claudia Boyle. Is this the hardest introduction to an opera ever composed?
It must be, and I think if your the viewers don't know this, just try the first 2 minutes of this because you'll either love it or hate it. But it's like I mean, what he's trying to depict is Alice falling down. She falls
Alice
down
in
a hole,
Wonderland,
you
Lewis
know.
Carroll. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you have this terrific sort of arpeggios up and down and up and down and up and down, and she's sort of falling and falling and falling. And it's just so funny and so engaging and very difficult to sing. I mean, incredibly difficult. And Gerald Barry, who again, some people may know of him, but he's now, I think he's around 70 or so, but he's been very active. He's written a lot of operas. He has a very individual voice, compositionally. He doesn't sound like anybody else, and nobody else
Mhm.
sounds like him. He's his own person, and I love him as a person. I love him dearly. He was a complete nightmare to deal with when we made this recording because he's so absolutely uncompromising to the nth degree about anything. But that's what's brilliant about him. And there were
Mhm.
times when I wanted to like strangle him, because he wouldn't let us do certain things or he wanted things certain ways and everything. And but we got there in the end, and we're still friends, and we still have a laugh.
Mhm.
But he's a force of nature, and he's a person who's very dear to me as a friend and a colleague.
So, Fergus Sheil, happy St. Patrick's Day to you.
Thank you very
Keep up
much,
the
Fred.
good work. I hope that I've had other Irish people on before, and not just on the 17th of March on this program. Connor Hanratty, Deborah Kelleher, Tara Rott. And obviously, I love your country. That doesn't have to be repeated too often. But I want people to understand that, yes, Finland initially was the one that punched way above its weight artistically for its population and history. But Ireland is right up there now in terms of opera and classical music.
Hmm.
And you have great composers. You have a wonderful academy in the Royal Irish Academy of Music. You have a historic festival in Wexford. You have an ambitious new company, which is yours, the Irish National Opera. You have this vibrant theater scene. You have audiences that are receptive to the arts. You have a government that understands the role of the arts. And so I think you're entering not a golden age, an emerald age. How about
Yes.
that? And I thank you so much, and I hope to see you in New York.
Yeah, lovely to speak to you. Thank you, Fred.
Okay, be well. Keep up the good work.